So welcome to all, Aging with Expectations, all with the purpose of better mental health. So today's topic is on the spirituality of, or the science of spirituality. And I'd like to introduce Stephen Koski, who will be presenting today, and from Bend in Oregon, and myself, I'm Kathryn von Treuer. So using the Zoom webinar, you can see up on the slide here. So if you've got any questions or you're welcome to ask, please just click on the chat box and you can write something in, and or in the Q&A session, and we can get back to you on that. So please feel welcome to make any comments as we go. But first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and indeed on any lands on where we're meeting, because we're not all in here, Australia. But we'd like to pay our respects to our Indigenous elders, past and present, and any elders of the community that might be watching this presentation at all. We extend this respect to Indigenous peoples from around the world and to any First Nations people who come across our presentation. I'll hand over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathryn, and so great to be here. And this particular topic on the science of spirituality, I'm excited because I actually think Dr. Macnab, Dr. Francis Macnab, would actually love this topic. He would love to be leading this topic. I know 35 years ago when he first brought me to Australia. In many ways, I was always curious, but in many ways, in a way of depth, he's probably the first person who introduced me to the idea of the science of spirituality. And so I just want to take a second to just acknowledge his life and acknowledge his legacy with a nod of thanks and gratitude. So the science of spirituality, it seems like it would be appropriate to begin with a scientist as we approach the topic of the science of spirituality. So what better scientist to begin with than Einstein? So I want to share a quote from Einstein, which is actually in a letter that he wrote to his daughter. So Albert Einstein said, "If we want our species to survive, if we are to find meaning in our lives, if we want to save the world and every sentient being on it, then love is the one and only answer." So that's a scientist, probably the most preeminent scientist in history, suggesting to us that love, suggesting to us that something that perhaps has to do with spirituality is the one and only answer. Andrew Newberg, neuroscientist, wrote a book called How God Changes Your Brain. And I just want to take a moment before people start thinking, now, wait a minute, he has a reverend in front of his name. Looks like he works at a church. Is he going to be talking about religion? In a few moments, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation to talk about the distinction between spirituality and religion. So I'm not going to be talking about religion. I'm not going to be imposing my particular religion upon you. But we're really going to be focusing on spirituality and trying to explore what does that mean, and even what is the distinction between religion and spirituality. But there is this amazing study by Andrew Newberg, who's a neuroscientist, and he wrote a book called How God Changes the Brain. And we could say how God changes the brain. You might use a word, how source changes the brain, how the universe changes the brain, how the ground of all being changes the brain. I mean, all of us might have a different word for that, which is perhaps greater than ourselves. But in this study, he discovered, he took a group of people and he invited them to simply contemplate love. You know, perhaps as they think about God, he invited them to contemplate just simply the source of unconditional love, or the presence of unconditional love. And he kind of taught them how to just sit and be mindful and to contemplate love. So back to Einstein again, love being the one and only answer. And what he discovered is that in these research subjects who took the time to contemplate love, of all things, it actually thickened the area in the brain that is the anterior insular cortex. Now, I want to make a disclaimer. I am not a neuroscientist. I know nothing about neuroscience. I was sharing earlier that I'm a pastor. I do a lot of other things as well, but that's one of the things I do. And when you're on an airplane, you never tell somebody that you're a pastor because one, you're going to hear their life story, and two, you're going to hear what they hate about church or why they don't go to church. Quite frankly, I'm okay with you not going to church, and I don't really need to hear why or why not you don't go to church. So this particular time, I just didn't want to get into conversation with anyone. So I decided that the first and only time on an airplane, I decided to lie. And so when this person sitting next to me in the plane said, well, what do you do for a living? I thought, well, okay, what will shut down conversation? So I said, I'm a neurosurgeon. To my surprise, the woman sitting next to me said, wow, so am I. And then she went on to say, are you going to the same conference that I'm going to? So not only did I have to say, well, actually, I'm a pastor, I then had to say, well, I'm also a pastor who lies. I apologize for that. So again, what he discovered is simply inviting his research subjects to contemplate love. It thickened the anterior insular cortex part of the brain. And that just happens to be the part of the brain connected to empathy. So the mysterious, wonderful thing is in inviting these research subjects to take time thinking about love, it actually made them more empathetic. So to take the time to actually a spiritual practice, a sustained spiritual practice, just simply being mindful of love, they became more loving. In some ways, in thinking about, like, again, a God of love or the source of love, or a universe that's grounded in love, whatever kind of language you want to use, by thinking about love, they then became the very reflection of that love in the world. And it was the Dalai Lama who said, the brain we develop reflects the life we lead. So one could argue from that study that our brains are hardwired to be in union with the divine, to be in union with this which is sacred, to be in union with love. And if we can learn how to strengthen that connection, it could actually change the way that we are present in the world. So for a few moments, we're going to talk about what is that link between spirituality and well-being, the link between spirituality and the way we live in this world, the way we show up in this world, the way we show up to others. What is the link between spirituality and mental health? I mean, that's what these webinars are all about. Aging with expectation and improving our mental health. So at the heart of what we're going to talk about is, well, how can we kind of explore spiritual practices that just might improve our mental health? So we're going to take some time to even think about, well, what is spirituality? How would we define spirituality? What is spirituality to us? And then we're going to want to share 4 ways that we might actually strengthen our own spiritual core. So I'm curious, Kathryn, starting with what is spirituality? If we started with that, how would you define spirituality?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? And I wonder whether we all have so much difficulty with it because it's perhaps a very personal experience of what spirituality is. And if we can't actually see it in front of us, it's difficult sometimes, but to explain it to others. But I really love some of the words that you were using before, and the saying, what was it about being mindful of love, and then you can become more loving. And I think words around that you used around empathy, and just having that understanding. I would also love to add in there words around a sense of peacefulness. And so being able to be mindful and sitting with a sense of peace, to me, whether that sense of peace is something that I'm generating or is coming from another person or being, I'm quite open to where that peace comes from, but also, and just being connected with that peace to allow yourself to love someone else and something else, and then having that presence, with that peace with you and that love with you, and the gratitude that we've talked about in previous episodes, and being able to express that with another person is some of the linking as well. But to me, spirituality is very much about peacefulness. It's about tapping into that sense of almost freedom and innocence in a way, and openness. So they're the sort of things that spring to mind, but it's not like a dictionary clear definition. I think it's an experience.
Yeah, I love that. I think I read once that someone said that religion is someone else's experience of love, and spirituality is your own experience of love, which is kind of interesting. And I love that sense of peace. And I'm really curious as to whether or not we have an innate spiritual capacity. I mentioned earlier that I think we're actually hardwired to be in union with love, hardwired to be in union with God, with source, with universe, whatever. But it's this idea of, I wonder sometimes whether or not it's not like we don't have a spiritual life, because if we say, my spiritual life, that then would suggest, well, then other aspects of our life somehow are not spiritual. My spiritual life is over here. Well, I mean, our work can be very spiritual. Our friendships can be very spiritual. Our recreation can be very spiritual. So it makes me wonder whether or not we actually have this innate spiritual capacity. And it's not so much that we have a spiritual life as it perhaps is we are spiritual, deeply at the core of who we are, that we are spiritual. I think sometimes you mentioned the word peace. Wonder why sometimes just being in the presence of a baby changes our mind-body state. What is it about just a baby that all of a sudden, if we're tense, we're relaxed, and we're in this sense of wonder about this child? Or being out in nature. Sometimes just being out in nature lifts you beyond the worries in your mind, the stress in your mind, and you feel this connection with something else. Or art does that at times, or music might do it at times, or sometimes actually altruism, when you go out of your way to serve others. Why is it that doing good makes you feel good? What is it about the human being and the makeup of the human being that, almost without exception, I would even say without exception, that when we are altruistic, when we are focused on serving others, caring for others, there's something about that we end up feeling good. We end up having the experience of peace. We end up having the experience of satisfaction. We end up having the experience of love, which again makes me wonder whether we are innately spiritual. Brene Brown, go ahead. You go, jump in.
Yeah. I've got some thoughts on that, and I remember speaking with the psychotherapist once, and they were talking about how and it comes back to your point, Stephen, asking the question about are we born this way or is it hardwired? And they gave the analogy, which I quite like, of, you know, that we're all, as we're born and we're babies and we're innocent, and a young child is actually quite innocent, and then as you grow up and grow older and you get told you should do this, you shouldn't do that, and they drew a picture in my head where they said it's like a mummy, you know, where you start having bandages put on you and you start becoming really restricted by all the shoulds and don'ts and what you have to do and shouldn't do, and sometimes, you know, psychotherapy, but also just accessing that spirituality at times might be, you know, taking off those bandages and feeling that more sense of peace with yourself and not being so constrained by what the others are telling you. And but they would have certainly argued that, you know, at our most spiritual is perhaps when we're born, but we can work on getting in contact with that by how we behave and what we do.
Yeah. I love that. It actually reminds me of a story that I read in the New England Medical Journal. And it's reported to be a true story about this couple who had a 3-year-old. And then they gave birth to a baby boy. And the 3-year-old was a girl. And when they brought the baby home, the 3-year-old insisted on spending time alone with her baby brother. And they're thinking, oh, you know, is this sibling rivalry or something? But they had one of those baby monitors. So they thought if they could just, you know, stand outside the door and listen, it would be okay. So they did that, and they allowed the 3-year-old little girl to go talk to her baby, like we're talking infant, just days old. And they listened as this 3-year-old walked to the crib, and they were shocked when they heard the 3-year-old say to her little brother, "Tell me about God. I'm beginning to forget." And as like, to me, part of what spirituality, and we're going to talk about awe, AWE, a little later, but awe is that experience of that which you can't define, that which you can't really understand. Because I think part of what spirituality is mystery. And mystery isn't a negative word. Mystery isn't the absence of meaning. Mystery is the presence of more meaning than our minds can comprehend. I think mystery is the presence of that greater reality that just sits beyond the veil of this reality. So I just love that sense of we are born good, we are born worthy, we are born as love, and somehow we forget, or somehow people mummify us and make us forget. I often say that the spiritual path is not the path to somehow prove your worthiness. The spiritual path is the awakening of your worthiness that has always been yours, and the unlearning of everything that has taught you otherwise. You know, there's also a story, and again, they say it's true. And I often say things don't have to be factual to be true. Meaning there might be something in that story, even though somebody might come and say, well, I really question the facts of that. But there's still a truth in the story that resonates something deep. I know when I first heard that story about "Tell me about God, I'm beginning to forget," it touched something deep in me. And to me, that's what makes it true. But this story takes place in Thailand, and apparently centuries ago, there was this village that had a 10-foot golden Buddha. You might have heard this story, this 10-foot golden Buddha. And to protect this treasured gift of this village from their enemies around, they covered the golden Buddha in clay. And so for centuries, at the center of this village was not the golden Buddha, but this clay Buddha. But underneath the clay was solid gold. Well, apparently this village was invaded, and everyone was wiped out. So in being wiped out, so was the knowledge that underneath the clay was pure gold. And apparently the enemies left it alone because it's just clay. They didn't realize that underneath the clay was something invaluable until centuries later, where they were wanting to build a road through that village. And in building the road, they needed to move this 10-foot clay Buddha. And in moving it, it cracked. And they began to see just a glimmer of light. And then they started to chisel away. And much to everybody's amazement, they discovered a 10-foot solid gold Buddha. And I'm wondering if that's the definition of spirituality, that's, we have this essence, but it gets covered and we forget that essence. And if we talk a little bit about just to make the distinction between spirituality and religion, I personally think spirituality I believe is this innate core of who we are, this innate essence, this connection, I would call it the inextricable connection. The word I'm comfortable with is God. Not everybody's comfortable with that word. So it might be the inextricable connection with the source or love or universe. And an inextricable connection, because of that connection with love, we are inextricably connected to one another and to the world. And I think religion is the human construct that is intended to help us awaken to that connection. And unfortunately, sometimes I use the example of spirituality is the island of unitive consciousness. If spirituality is the island of love, religion is intended to be the bridge that will carry us to the island. But what we've done is we put so many rules on the bridge as to who can cross and who can't cross, and we put so many restrictions on the bridge, and only these people can cross this bridge. And in order to cross this bridge, here's the password. Here's the secret handshake, or here are the things you have to believe. And if you don't believe these things, you can't cross the bridge, or all this rubbish. And what's happened in putting so many ornaments and restrictions and rules and regulations and beliefs and all of this on the bridge, that people have forgotten that the bridge is actually supposed to carry you somewhere. And we end up worshiping the bridge and not seeing that the bridge is actually just simply a vehicle to take us to that greater reality. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest, once said, you can believe all the right things and you can be the most religious person in the world and still be a jerk. So maybe the essence or the purpose of religion is not believing all the right things. Maybe it's learning how not to be a jerk and learning how to develop the capacity to be a more loving person in this world. But I think I sometimes wonder, though, to get back into spirituality, whether we've thrown the spiritual baby out with the religious bathwater. Because I see a lot of people, in rejecting religion, at least in the United States, I think are also rejecting the beauty of spirituality and the reservoir of wisdom that spirituality can bring. I mean, we're in the midst of a mental health crisis, amongst teenagers, for example. And I sometimes wonder about just kind of throwing the spiritual baby out with the religious bathwater, whether we're depriving people of tools and resources that will help them connect to joy, that will help them connect to beauty, that will help them connect to love. Lisa Miller, and I'm going to just trust that you'll wave your hand and interrupt me, because you can tell I'm just slightly passionate about this subject. Dr. Lisa Miller wrote a book called The Awakened Brain. And she is a clinical psychologist. She is the director of the Mind, Body, Spirit Institute at Columbia University in New York City. She also wrote a book called The Spiritual Child. And she did just tons of peer reviews and also tons of MRIs of people. And what she discovered, that a child is 5 times less likely to be depressed if that child shares a sense of spirituality with their parent, grandparent, or important adult. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing. So if a child somehow shares ritual, shares moments of spirituality, shares kind of sustained spiritual practice of some kind with a parent, they're 5 times less likely to be depressed as a teenager. She discovered in her research that children who have positive, active, ongoing, sustainable relationships to spirituality are 60% less likely to be depressed as teenagers. They are 40% less likely to use and abuse substances. So in her research, she comes to the conclusion that a person's spiritual life, to develop some kind of sustained spiritual practice, is the greatest resource and the greatest preventer of depression, loneliness, anxiety, and substance abuse among children and among adults. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts about the link between spirituality and well-being?
Yeah, I think it's something that I think spirituality is perhaps very grounding and provides a connection and with parents, particularly if a child is sharing that same connection and similarity with the parents. I think it would probably lead and make sense that it would lead to quite harmony and well-being and things as well. And I guess it's also being, you know, if we think about spirituality as being innocent and loving and things too, that those are very stabilizing sort of emotions and things to have, and to be able to share that with someone's family would be very strengthening to the soul and someone's well-being, for sure. It makes sense.
So it seems like whether or not someone's religious or not, this idea that every single one of us is almost naturally a spiritual being. And if we can embrace that and find ways that people can nurture that part of themselves, it seems to lead to things like joy and zest and meaning and purpose. And as you were saying earlier, peace. There was a research done recently in the US Army where suicide was happening, death by suicide was happening in epidemic proportions among servicemen and women, particularly servicemen and women between the ages of 18 and 25. And they didn't know what to do. They tried all sorts of things. And what they did is they introduced a program that supported, I guess you would call it spiritual care, that somehow supported the servicemen and women, supported the spiritual aspects of their life in some way. And that might, I mean, for some it was mindfulness training, for some it was meditation, for some it was journaling, for some it was inviting them painting, for some it was singing, whatever it happened to be. There was all sorts of different practices, but it was specifically practices to cultivate and strengthen their spiritual core. And they followed them And because the key part was a sustained spiritual practice. So it wasn't kind of a one-off thing. It was a sustained spiritual practice. And after 1 year, the rates of suicide reduced by 35%, which to me is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. You know, just by paying attention to, attending to, nurturing the spiritual part of a person, the spirit of a person. It actually made a huge difference in the depression that they were experiencing, and reduced suicide, which is pretty extraordinary, don't you think?
Absolutely. And I think anything that can certainly help people's well-being is important and worth trying. And I think what you've described is lots of pathways to sort of being spiritual. And I wonder somewhere too whether there's a link between being spiritual and having that sort of sense of hope of knowing what being spiritual can be like, and knowing that if you can get back to that place and back to that point and that sense of connection and peacefulness, whether having that sense of hope also leads to people feeling better and hopeful that they will be in a better place next week or the next month or the next year.
And I love the idea too of hope. I often say positive thinking is like changing your shirt when you really need a shower. You know, I mean, positive thinking is a really good thing, and I'm a proponent of positive thinking, but sometimes it can only take you so far. I mean, if I'm in my garden, I might do a lot of positive affirmations. There are no weeds. There are no weeds. Well, the weeds got to grow and wrap themselves around my ankles. Where hope, I think, is something else. Hope, I think, is at a deeper place. And hope, I think, is that sense, again, back to the baby. It's recovering that sense that you are a person of worth. You are a person of value, that you are loved. And if you can tap into that sense, you know, if you can kind of wash the clay off and recover the gold that's at the essence, it just might give you that sense of hope to continue. So I want to share 4 ways. So if we kind of conclude that we are innately spiritual, what might 4 ways be to kind of strengthen that spiritual core? And the first way I want to emphasize, I think, is just space. And what I mean by space, Viktor Frankl's beautiful work where he said between the stimulus and the response, or between the things that happen to us in life and how we respond, there's a gap. There's space. And in that space is our spiritual core. In that space is our freedom and our capacity to choose our response. In that space is our resiliency. In that space is hope. But for most of us, that space is razor thin, I think. And so with the space being razor thin, we're not aware of our spiritual core. And we live in a constant state of fight, flight. And if you think of the scale between 0 and 10, where 0, you're calm, you're relaxed, you're centered, you're zen, that peace you talked about. And 10, you're about to blow a gasket. You're just about to lose it. I actually think we live at 8. The word I would use is relentless. Life is just relentless. You know, a wave, we get overcome by the wave, and just the moment we rise and find ourselves able to take a breath, the next wave comes. And the next wave comes before we even can take the next breath. And that seems to be the life that we're living, back that wonderful survival mechanism of the brain, when he saw the saber-toothed tiger, for all of the adrenaline to go to the body so that you can either fight or flee. But now there are no saber-toothed tigers, at least I haven't seen any recently. but the stupid smartphone that I carry with me all the time keeps dinging. Or on the television, I remember a time, I don't know if the same thing happens in Australia, but I remember a time when breaking news happened maybe once a month. And when it happened, when the ticker on the TV would say breaking news, it was actually breaking news. But now it's 24/7, breaking news, breaking news, breaking news, breaking news. And I don't know about kind of what the climate is currently in Australia, but the climate in America, there is so much hostility. There is so much anger. There is so much anxiety. There is so much fear. So what I mean by that is I think actually we live at 8 and that we've become accustomed to it and we think we're at 4. And notice then it doesn't take much. It might be that phone call. It might be something someone saying the wrong thing. And poof, we react. We overreact. I mean, I was at the light just the other day, and the light turned green, and the person in front of me, I was behind one car, and clearly she was looking on her phone and texting on her phone or something. And the light was green and she wasn't moving. And I'm embarrassed to say that I got irate. I mean, I was fuming. I was clenching the steering wheel. I was ready to blare on the horn until I noticed it was somebody from my church. So fortunately, I took a breath. So the point I'm making in this is, again, the space was razor thin. I think I think our spiritual work these days is to widen the gap, is to make space so that we don't react to life from fear, from frustration, from anxiety, but we make space so that we have a spiritual response to life from a deeper place of wisdom, compassion, empathy, love. When we are in fight, flight, compassion and empathy and wisdom don't stand a chance. So how can we make space? Harvard University did a study where they trained people in mindfulness for 8 weeks. And in those 8 weeks, so they trained them how to be mindful, how to meditate. Essentially what they were training them how to do was to create space, right? And what they discovered in that mindfulness is a practice of slow, deep breathing shrank the amygdala, the fear-centered part of the brain. It had actually thickened the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So they did MRIs of all of the people who were doing this mindfulness training. They did MRIs before they began the training. They did MRIs kind of partway through, midway through, 3/4 of the way through, and they did MRIs at the end. And they found in all of the subjects that the amygdala became more thin and the prefrontal cortex thickened. Well, the amygdala is the fear center, so that fear center became thin or shrank, and the prefrontal cortex is where perception and reason and clarity exist in the brain. So basically, what that really means is just through simple mindfulness training, less fear, more wisdom. So can you imagine, again, imagine that maybe our brain is hardwired to be in union with God. It's this idea that sometimes we think that somehow we have to attain the presence of the divine. We have to achieve the presence of the divine. We have to behave well to somehow earn the presence of the divine. We have to work hard to arrive at the presence of the divine. And I think the mystery of what some of these things teach us is that we are always in the presence of the divine. What's missing is mindfulness. What's missing is awareness. So think of the implications of that. Think of the implications of less fear and more wisdom. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, Stephen, it's just making me think that, you know, we want to be in that place of mindfulness, and whether it's religion or practicing mindfulness, you know, they're all pathways to getting to that inner core and sense of peace and wisdom and things. So mindfulness and meditation are certainly, you know, excellent tools, and religion is something else, as you gave that beautiful analogy before about the bridge, you know, to being spiritual. Sometimes it is nice to have people hang on to your hand and take you on that pathway. Sometimes we've got the energy to do it on our own and practice mindfulness. So I think they're really good ideas to use to try and get back in contact with your spirituality and what being spiritual is.
It's interesting just simply to ask the question, what helps you breathe? What helps you create space? You know, what are those things that, you know, that will help you? So if our spiritual work is to somehow not react, you know, from fear and frustration and anger, anxiety, but if our spiritual work is to tap into something deeper so that we have a spiritual response, not a reaction, but a spiritual response that's grounded in wisdom and compassion, you know, what will help you create the space, you know, to tap into that? And for some, it might be breathing. Think breath, a simple, slow, deep breath. It's fascinating, the word in Hebrew for breath is the same word for spirit. So it's this idea that somehow breath itself connects us to source, connects us to God, connects us to the divine, connects us to the sacred. Just simply being mindful of our breath. There is actually no word in Hebrew for spirituality. And how I understand that, like I'm a follower of Jesus. That's my grounding. I don't believe Jesus is the only way to God. Jesus is the story that makes sense to me, and I seek to do the best I can to follow his teachings and his wisdom. That if you go to Jesus and you'd say, "Tell me about your spiritual life," he wouldn't have had any idea what you're talking about, because for him, all of life was spiritual. And throughout the Gospels, which are essentially what the Gospels are just stories about Jesus. And if you read these stories about Jesus, quite frequently, it says he went away to a mountain, or he went onto a lake by himself. And then if you read the stories, something amazing always happened following that. You know, somebody was healed or some amazing wisdom he taught. So it really seemed to be from that time of being off by himself. You know, you go apart so you don't fall apart. So when he went apart by himself, grounded himself, you know, deep breathing, you know, tapped into that wisdom and compassion, that's where the purpose flowed. That's where the healing flowed. So just simple breath is important. The next one is, what is the next one? Awe. Speaking of awe, I really think one of the things that helps us kind of tap into our spiritual core is awe and curiosity and wonder. Abraham Heschel is a Jewish philosopher, and he once said the goal of the spiritual life is to live your life in radical amazement. You know, Yeah, I'd love to ask all of those listening, is that how you define the way you live your life? Do you live your life in radical amazement? Where he said, well, you get up in the morning and you look around at the world and you take nothing for granted. You know, sometimes I just took a breath. What I took for granted is that breath's sheer gift. I mean, my heart is beating. I'm not really particularly mindful of my heart beating, but my heart's beating. That's not guaranteed. Sheer gift. Yeah. What's your sense of awe and wonder?
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me, your description of it reminds me of what I mentioned earlier about taking the bandages off, in terms of being in that mummified state of being told what you should or shouldn't do, and I guess having that sense of wonderment and openness, taking the bandages off and being free, and having that sense of freedom to think about things that you want to or need to or used to think about. So I think that's definitely part of being in contact with that spiritual sense of who you are as a person. So yeah, I can see it as a component of spirituality.
Yeah. I often think to myself, well, what if God or source, divine, sacred, what if God was not the object of our knowledge? So often we think of religion that we need to learn more, you know, so that God somehow is the object of our knowledge. What if instead God was the catalyst of our wonder? That it wasn't so much about, you know, believing these 8 things and making sure you believe the right 8 things, but maybe it's about wonder and awe and continuing to live your life in radical amazement. I mean, how beautiful would that be? Yeah. And the final, go ahead.
It just reminds me of, I didn't read it myself, a friend did, I must confess, but the book was called Radical Forgiveness. And if you radically forgive people, I think it makes room for radical amazement, doesn't it?
Yeah. I often think Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, said to love is to forgive. And I think that also is forgiveness. You know, if you think of resentment and hate and bitterness, back to that mummy, you know, are the wraps around us that prevent us from tapping into the golden essence. Maybe forgiveness is unwrapping ourselves so our hearts can be free. So the goldenness of our hearts and the goldenness of our spirit can be free once again, rather than covered up. To me, the most amazing, again, I'm not assuming anyone is Christian, and I don't necessarily suggest that's the best path for you. It's my path. It's the story that makes most sense to me. And one of the reasons why it makes most sense to me is I believe Jesus was crucified not to somehow for my sins. I don't even understand that, if I'm honest. He was crucified that he loved at such a depth and with such a passion, and he was so in touch with his own spiritual essence, and he lived from that place in such a fierce way that the state couldn't stand it, and so they killed him. And he lived from such a deep place of love that even in that place of crucifixion, he looked at the people who nailed the nails in his hands and said, I forgive you. I mean, that's just a profound spiritual core, that even the evils of oppression couldn't stop, you know, the power and the depth of that love. And I think that's really, to a certain extent, what spirituality is about, is connecting to that love, which in some ways is related to the last point about connecting to our spiritual core, which is service. That, again, you do good. It's amazing to me that when you do good, you feel good. Why do you think that is, Kathryn?
I think because you're sharing something, you're showing gratitude. You know, there's a lot of you're giving other people hope, but you also have hope for yourself too, in a polite, nice sort of selfish way, that you have some connection with somebody else that you can do. And I think that it's and it is again tapping into that higher level of what you can contribute to the world and to yourself.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can explain it better than that. It sounds a bit clumsy, but that's the best.
Oh, no, not at all.
Explain. Yeah.
And I think the neuroscientists also, again, did brain scans of people who served, who were altruistic, who did things for other people. And again, that part in the brain that is most connected to empathy thickened. So again, the most amazing thing when you get in touch with your core and you care about others, it actually changes your brain. I mean, that whole neuroplasticity that by continuing to have sustained spiritual practice in a particular way, it can change the neural pathways, and we become more loving, we become more caring, we show up in the world with a greater sense of empathy, and you know, when you do good, you feel good. It was George Bernard Shaw who said the true joy in life is being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. And I think there's a sense of that. Again, I think tapping into that spiritual core of not just living for ourselves, but reaching beyond ourselves and caring about others, taps into kind of essentially who we are and why we are. Yeah. So I want to finish with just again that back to the baby, the 3-year-old. Tell me about God. I'm beginning to forget. Marvelous person, Father Greg Boyle, who started Homeboy Industries, which is the largest gang rehabilitation service in the world. They work with 50,000 gang members from Los Angeles and other places every year. And they provide them jobs, they provide them counseling, they provide them job training, tattoo removal, all sorts of things. And he said, and he works with people who've done some evil things, you know, as gang members. And he said, you know, I've never met an evil person in my life. I certainly have met a lot of people who have yet to be introduced to their goodness and their essence. And he says, resilience shows up when you become aware of your own unshakable goodness. That when you become aware of your own unshakable goodness, you can't help but embody that goodness in the world. And so I think, again, it's getting in touch with that which is most essentially who we are. As you began at the very beginning, and you said, as children, we are born good. And then the wrapping starts happening. So spirituality, I think, is both a remembering and an unwrapping. So it's just inviting people to think about, you know, what are those things that will help you remember who you essentially are, that will help you unwrap all of the ways that people have tried to teach you otherwise. What are those things that will help you create space, breathe? What are those things that will invite you to live your life in radical amazement? And what can you do for others? So as always, it's just such a joy to spend this time in conversation with you, and I hope it's been beneficial for those who've listened in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. I'm feeling quite inspired, and I think that I just need a little bit of time to reflect too. I think after this session, and hearing all your good words and ideas. So thank you so much. For everyone listening, we would like to know how we're going. So we'd really appreciate hearing your feedback via our online survey. Your answers, they're anonymous, so please feel welcome to complete the survey. It lets us know how we're going and what we might need to improve. And certainly if there's other topics you would like in the future, please let us know and pop them into the chat. And you've also got both Stephen and my email there that you're welcome to contact us directly as well. So as always, we talk about the big tent, but it's even more pertinent today with our discussion about child and spirituality and things too, and wanting to protect our children and hopefully help our children reach their potential. And the Big Tent program does this through helping support workers who work with smaller children to understand their needs and strengthen their positivity in life and look after their emotional needs and supports. So you're more than welcome to donate to the Big Tent. You can use the QR code on the screen if that's helpful, but you don't have to either. So otherwise, next time, Stephen will be speaking on the art of seeing and being seen. So strengthening our connections. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's on the 7th of March. And I hope to see you all there and bring your friends along. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, Stephen. Appreciate every word that comes out of your mouth. And we look forward to the audience coming and joining us again soon. Thank you.
All right.